Rome, 15th century. Majestic cathedral domes rise above the city, where the fates not only of Italy but of the entire Christian world are decided. The Vatican is not just a religious center, but a true battlefield, where the weapons are not only swords and daggers, but also golden florins, secret treaties, and elegant political intrigues. Two powerful clans chose this sacred land as the arena for their confrontation. Their names were whispered in luxurious palazzi and spoken with trepidation in poor quarters: the Medici and the Borgia. One came from the world of finance, transforming a humble money changer's shop into a Florentine banking empire. The others, Spanish émigrés, who paved their way to power through the church hierarchy. These families embodied two different philosophies of achieving power. The Medici believed in the power of money and cultural influence. The Borgia, in ruthless political maneuvering and family ties. Their confrontation became a true clash of worlds, where control over the most influential institution of the era, the Catholic Church, was at stake. The history of the Medici banking dynasty begins in the shadow of Florence's narrow 14th century streets. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, a man with a tenacious mind and an incredible knack for money, opened a modest money-changing shop, unaware that he was laying the foundation for one of the greatest financial empires of the Renaissance. At a time when the church officially forbade usury and interest rates were considered sinful, Giovanni found an elegant solution: currency exchange operations where profit was hidden in the exchange rate difference. This was the beginning of an ingenious financial strategy that soon attracted the attention of Europe's most influential client, the Papal See. The Vatican, with its enormous cash flows from donations and tithes, needed a reliable financial partner. Giovanni offered the papal curia not just safekeeping of funds, but an entire system of financial services: transfers between dioceses, financing cathedral construction, and managing charitable foundations. By 1410, the Medici Bank already had branches in key cities in Italy and beyond. The Roman branch of the bank, located literally in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, became the financial heart of the papal court. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, inherited not only the banking network, but also special relationships with the church hierarchy. He masterfully developed a system where high-ranking church officials became personally invested in the bank's prosperity. The Medici provided them with personal loans, managed cardinals' private fortunes, and even financed their struggles for the papal tiara. By the mid-15th century, the Medici Bank controlled almost the entire papal treasury, which gave the Florentine bankers unprecedented influence. When the time for a conclave came, cardinals, bound by financial obligations to the Medici, knew for whom they should vote. This was power that required no official titles, the power of money and promissory notes. Unlike their future rivals, the Borgias, the Medici did not seek to occupy the papal throne themselves. Their strategy was more subtle: to keep pontiffs on a financial leash, remaining in the shadows. The bankers understood that direct control over the Vatican would attract too much attention and provoke resistance from other influential families. Instead, they created a system in which any pope, regardless of origin, found himself dependent on the Florentine creditors. This was a chess move of the highest caliber in the grand game for influence in the Christian world. On the eastern coast of Spain, in the small Aragonese town of Zátiva, in the year 1378, a boy was born who was destined to change the history of the Catholic Church. His name was Alonso de Borja, a name that would later be Italianized into Borgia. Spain at that time was a patchwork quilt of Christian kingdoms, Moorish territories, and mixed cultural zones, where Catalan, Aragonese, and Castilian influences intertwined with Moorish and Jewish traditions. In this melting pot of cultures, the Borgia family belonged to the minor nobility, possessing neither significant wealth nor particular political weight. Young Alonso showed extraordinary abilities in academics, especially in law. He was educated at the University of Lleida, one of the oldest educational institutions on the Iberian Peninsula, where he studied canon and civil law. His career, it seemed, was predetermined, to become a provincial lawyer or notary. But fate had other plans. A turning point in Alonso's life was his meeting with Alfonso of Aragon, the future King of Naples. The young lawyer so impressed the prince with his knowledge and sharp mind that he was invited to become his personal secretary and advisor. When Alfonso set out to conquer the Kingdom of Naples in Italy, Alonso followed him, forever leaving his native Spain. In 15th century Italy, fragmented into dozens of warring and allying states, Alonso de Borgia quickly adapted. He displayed an astonishing aptitude for diplomacy, an ability to navigate between the interests of different parties and find compromises where others saw only conflict. These qualities did not go unnoticed in the Vatican. In 1429, Pope Martin V appointed him Bishop of Valencia, even though Alonso was not even a priest at the time. Within a few days, he received all the necessary holy orders, from simple priest to bishop. This rapid ascent up the ecclesiastical ladder was unusual, but not unprecedented for the time. Alonso de Borgia's true triumph was linked to his diplomatic talent. In 1444, he managed to persuade anti-pope Clement VIII to renounce his claims to the papal throne, thereby ending the last major schism in the Western Church. This diplomatic feat was highly praised by Pope Eugene IV, who, in 1444, elevated Alonso to the rank of cardinal. Now the Spaniard, who had adopted the Italianized version of his surname, Borgia, found himself at the heart of ecclesiastical politics. He settled in Rome, where he quickly built a network of contacts and allies. 15th century Florence flourished as never before. While other Italian city-states were mired in bloody conflicts, the capital of Tuscany was transforming into a true jewel of the Renaissance. Behind this transformation stood a man whose name did not appear in official documents as a ruler: Cosimo de' Medici, son of Giovanni di Bicci. He inherited from his father not only a banking empire, but also a unique understanding of how finance could transform into power without formal titles. Cosimo created a model of governance that would later be called never holding the post of gonfaloniere, the formal head of the Florentine Republic. He nevertheless controlled every significant decision of the city council. His methods were subtle and effective: generous loans to the right people, strategic marriages, philanthropy, and, of course, the impeccable reputation of a banker who always fulfilled his obligations. Unlike the future Borgias, Cosimo understood that true power did not require ostentatious display. When asked why he did not seek official titles, he replied with a phrase that became legendary. Cosimo transformed the Medici Bank into a true financial organism whose tentacles penetrated all spheres of Vatican life. His genius lay in creating a system whereby the papal throne found itself dependent on Florentine bankers without even realizing it. The Medici Bank financed the construction of new churches, the restoration of cathedrals, papal military campaigns, and even the personal expenses of the pontiffs. When the church treasury ran empty, which happened with surprising regularity, it was Cosimo who offered generous loans on favorable terms. Each new loan strengthened the Holy See's dependence on the Florentine banker. But Cosimo's true mastery was in transforming financial influence into cultural capital. Understanding that money could bring power but not respect, he became the greatest patron of his era. Majestic cathedrals, palaces, and libraries were built at his commission. He collected ancient manuscripts, saving the legacy of antiquity from oblivion. The greatest minds of the era, philosophers, artists, architects, found refuge at his court. When, in 1439, it was decided to move the Council of Ferrara to Florence, Cosimo not only fully funded this grandiose event, but also housed the delegates in his palaces. This was a masterful move. Now the entire Christian world saw him not merely as a banker, but as a pious patron of the Church. The philosopher Marsilio Ficino called Cosimo "Father of the Fatherland," a title previously held only by Roman emperors. In his relations with the Vatican, Cosimo acted with incredible subtlety. He never demanded immediate repayment of debts, understanding that the influence bestowed by the status of creditor to the papal throne was far more valuable than the money itself. When, in 1447, Pope Eugene IV found himself in a difficult financial situation, Cosimo not only restructured his debts, but also provided a new loan. In gratitude, the pontiff granted the Medici Bank the exclusive right to collect papal taxes in several regions, a privilege that brought stable income for decades. On April 8, 1455, white smoke above the Sistine Chapel announced the election of a new pontiff. It was 77-year-old Cardinal Alonso Borgia, who took the name Calixtus III. For the Medici banking house, this news struck like a bolt from the blue. Their protégé, Cardinal Prospero Colonna, despite generous funding and support, suffered defeat in the papal elections. For the first time in many years, the Florentine bankers failed to install their candidate on the throne. The newly elected pope had a reputation as an ascetic and a man of strict moral principles, but beneath this facade lay an iron will and unwavering devotion to his Spanish lineage. Calixtus's first steps on the papal throne revealed his true intentions. Unlike his predecessors, the new pontiff was in no hurry to confirm the financial privileges of the Medici Bank. Instead, he began methodically promoting his relatives and compatriots to key positions in the church hierarchy. Most significant was the appointment of his nephews, 25-year-old Rodrigo and 20-year-old Luis Juan Borgia, as cardinals, despite their youth and lack of spiritual experience. Rodrigo, a brilliant lawyer with a sharp mind and incredible ambition, stood out particularly. Calixtus saw in him the continuation of the family business and made no secret of his special relationship with his nephew. This wave of appointments, dubbed the quote, caused muffled discontent in the Roman Curia. Italian cardinals, accustomed to a certain distribution of power, suddenly found themselves pushed aside from the levers of control by Spaniards who had neither connections nor authority in Rome. For the Medici, such a policy posed a direct threat. For decades, they had built a system whereby the papal throne, regardless of the pontiff's personality, remained financially dependent on the Florentine bank. Now, Calixtus III was creating an alternative power structure, based not on money, but on kinship. When the Pope appointed his nephew Rodrigo as Vice-Chancellor of the Church, the second most important position in the Vatican, Cosimo de' Medici realized that he was facing a serious adversary. The Borgias operated on a completely different logic than previous popes. They did not seek compromises and were not afraid to conflict with established elites. Their goal was to create their own dynasty within the church hierarchy. Nepotism, the promotion of relatives, became the hallmark of Calixtus III's reign. But behind this seemingly primitive strategy lay a deep calculation. Each new appointment strengthened the clan's position, creating a network of mutual support and protection. The Medici, with their sophisticated financial schemes, suddenly found themselves confronted with the straightforward but effective tactics of the Spanish upstarts. Of particular concern to the Florentine bankers was Calixtus's desire to revise the Vatican's financial policy. He began seeking alternative sources of funding, turning to Spanish and Genoese bankers, traditional rivals of the Medici. This was a direct challenge to the Florentines' monopoly on papal finances. In the financial wars of the Renaissance, weapons were not swords but golden florins and cunning credit agreements. The Medici Bank created a veritable web of financial obligations that entangled the highest ecclesiastical hierarchy. The system worked flawlessly. Cardinals and bishops received personal loans on favorable terms, and in return found themselves in debt to the Florentine bankers. Many church dignitaries lived beyond their means. Luxurious palazzi, exquisite feasts, expensive works of art required a constant influx of money. And the Medici were always ready to provide the necessary sum, subtly reminding of their generosity when it was required to make one decision or another in favor of the bank. The practice of issuing loans to cardinals before a conclave was particularly sophisticated. Candidates for the papal throne needed significant funds to secure the support of colleagues, and the Medici willingly financed those candidates who seemed most loyal to the bank's interests. The winner, becoming pontiff, found himself indebted to the Florentines even before ascending to the throne of St. Peter. Cosimo de' Medici, and later his son Piero, turned this system into a true art, creating a mechanism of control that did not require formal power. They understood that promissory notes were sometimes stronger than papal bulls. However, the rise of the Borgia clan disrupted this well-oiled mechanism. The Spaniards employed a completely different strategy of financial control. Instead of giving money to the church, they decided to take control of the sources of ecclesiastical income. Rodrigo Borgia, becoming vice-chancellor under his uncle Calixtus III, gained access to the system of distributing ecclesiastical benefices, lucrative positions and parishes. He methodically placed his supporters in key posts, creating an alternative financial network independent of the Florentine bankers. In addition, the Borgias actively used their Spanish connections. Trading houses in Valencia and Barcelona, Genoese bankers, traditional rivals of the Medici, gained access to papal finances, which dealt a serious blow to the Florentines' monopoly. The case of financing the crusade against the Ottomans was particularly illustrative. Calixtus III was obsessed with the idea of recapturing Constantinople from the Turks and raised significant funds for this purpose. Contrary to established tradition, these funds were entrusted not to the Medici Bank, but to a consortium of Spanish and Genoese financiers associated with the Borgia family. For the Medici, this was not just a financial but also a symbolic blow. For the first time in decades, the papal throne demonstrated independence from Florentine capital. The Borgias understood that to weaken the Medici's influence, it was necessary to undermine the very foundation of their power: control over papal finances. Rodrigo Borgia initiated an audit of the Vatican's old debts, questioning the legality of many financial obligations to the Medici Bank. This was a daring move that could have led to a serious financial crisis, but the Spaniard was willing to risk it to weaken his main rivals. The clash of two financial strategies occurred against a backdrop of growing discontent among Italian cardinals with the quote, "zero" in the Curia. The Medici skillfully exploited this sentiment, financing the Borgia opposition and supporting those church hierarchs who opposed Calixtus III's nepotism. Thus, financial instruments became weapons in the political struggle that determined the future not only of the Vatican, but of all Italy. When Lorenzo de' Medici took over his family's banking empire in 1469, Florence was already a recognized center of the Renaissance. But the young heir, barely 20 years old, understood that in confrontation with the Borgias, financial leverage alone was insufficient. He needed a weapon capable of influencing not only people's purses, but also their hearts. This weapon became culture. Lorenzo, who had received a brilliant humanistic education, transformed his court into a true academy of arts. The best minds of the era, philosophers, poets, artists, gathered in his palazzo on Via Larga. Here, young Michelangelo first took up the chisel. Here, Botticelli created his immortal canvases. Here, Poliziano wrote poems celebrating beauty and harmony. Patronage of the arts was not merely a whim of a rich man for Lorenzo. Behind it lay a well-thought-out strategy. Every statue, every fresco, every building created under Medici patronage carried a specific message. Florence is the new Athens, a center of enlightenment and piety, and its unofficial rulers are not just bankers, but true defenders of Christian values and ancient wisdom. Lorenzo paid particular attention to religious art. Altarpieces and chapels were created at his behest, and ancient churches were restored. When Pope Sixtus IV in Rome, an opponent of the Medici, accused the Florentine banker of usury and sin, everyone in Florence could see how the wealth of the Medici bank was transformed into divine beauty. This strategy proved incredibly effective. Even the most ardent critics of the Medici could not deny their contribution to the development of Christian art. Unlike the Borgias, whose reputation suffered from rumors of simony and nepotism, Lorenzo created the image of a pious patron whose generosity seemed selfless. But behind this facade lay a cold calculation. Every florin invested in art returned 100-fold in the form of political influence. When in 1478, Pope Sixtus IV supported the Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici, it was Lorenzo's cultural authority that helped him prevail. European monarchs and humanists came to the defense of the man who had transformed Florence into the jewel of the Renaissance. Lorenzo skillfully used the image of an enlightened ruler in diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors arriving in Florence were stunned by the city's splendor and the erudition of its unofficial ruler. They returned home, convinced that they were dealing not with an ordinary banker, but with a philosopher on the throne, a worthy heir to Plato and Cicero. The Borgias, with their straightforward strategy of seizing power through family ties, lost to the Medici in this subtle game of symbols and images. They could control ecclesiastical benefices and military resources, but not the minds of men. Florence's cultural superiority became a powerful argument in the political confrontation with the Roman Curia. The summer of 1492 in Rome was unusually hot. The scorching sun mercilessly beat down on the Eternal City, but the real heat blazed in the closed rooms of the cardinals' palaces. The death of Pope Innocent VIII plunged the Vatican into a feverish state. The struggle for the throne of St. Peter was beginning. Among the contenders, the figure of the 60-year-old Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia stood out. Nephew of the late Pope Calixtus III, Vice-Chancellor of the Church, and one of the wealthiest men in Rome. Over many years of service to the Curia, the Spaniard had become a true master of political intrigue. Now his hour had come. Unlike many cardinals, Rodrigo did not hide his ambitions. His palace on Piazza Sforzacosta became the headquarters of his election campaign, where the strategy for seizing the papal throne was devised. Borgia understood perfectly. To win the conclave, not only political alliances were needed, but also hard cash. every vote had its price, and Rodrigo was ready to pay. His fortune, accumulated over decades of church service, was now to serve a decisive purpose. When, on August 23rd, 23 cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel to elect a new pope, Borgia already knew that victory was near. He methodically worked on each elector, offering incredibly generous gifts. To Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of the Duke of Milan, he promised the position of vice-chancellor and his luxurious palace with all its furnishings. Cardinal Orsini received castles in the vicinity of Rome and benefices worth several thousand ducats annually. Cardinal Colonna received the Abbey of Subiaco with its adjacent lands. Even the elderly Cardinal Gentile, known for his incorruptibility, could not resist the temptation of 5 wagons filled with silver. This was the most expensive conclave in the history of the Church. The Medici Bank, which traditionally financed papal elections, was left out. Borgia used his own funds, accumulated over decades of his ecclesiastical career. When, on August 11th, white smoke announced the election of a new pope, no one was surprised that it was Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Alexander VI. Florence met the news of his election with poorly concealed anxiety. Lorenzo the Magnificent was no longer alive, and his son Piero did not possess his father's political genius. The Medici Bank, which had controlled papal finances for decades, suddenly found itself facing a pontiff who not only did not need their services, but also openly demonstrated hostility towards the Florentine bankers. Alexander VI made no secret of his intention to reform the Vatican's financial system. One of his first decisions was to create a commission to review the Holy See's debt obligations. Many loans issued by the Medici Bank to previous popes were declared dubious and requiring verification. This was a direct blow to the financial power of the Florentines. 2 sons of Alexander VI became the embodiment of the Borgia clan's military might, but each in their own way. Juan, Duke of Gandia, was the public face of the family, handsome, charming, fond of luxury and lavish ceremonies. He commanded the papal troops more nominally, enjoying the honors and privileges of his position. In contrast, Cesare, despite his cardinal's rank, displayed extraordinary military talents. A cold-blooded strategist with an analytical mind, he preferred to operate from the shadows, developing complex military operations and diplomatic combinations. Alexander VI made no secret of his plans to create a strong, centralized state in central Italy under his family's rule. This required a powerful military force capable of resisting both external enemies and unruly vassals. The papal army, traditionally weak and poorly organized, needed a radical reform. And here, Cesare Borgia's genius came to the fore. He created a fundamentally new military structure, based on a combination of mercenary detachments and his own troops, personally loyal to the Borgia family. Special attention was paid to artillery, a new type of weaponry capable of deciding the outcome of battles. Cesare personally supervised the procurement of cannons and the training of artillerymen, understanding that technological superiority was more important than troop numbers. Financing this war machine required enormous funds. Alexander VI unhesitatingly directed church revenues to the military needs of his sons. The papal treasury was depleted at an unprecedented rate, causing outrage in the Curia. Cardinals associated with the Medici Bank were particularly indignant. Florentine bankers, who had been lending to the Holy See for decades, saw their money being used to create a military force that directly threatened their influence in the region. In the spring of 1497, Cesare began a series of military campaigns against the petty tyrants of Romagna, a region formerly belonging to the Papal States but actually fragmented into dozens of independent possessions. Cities fell one after another before the combined might of papal diplomacy and Borgia military force. Cesare proved himself a ruthless yet effective ruler, combining intimidation with a reasonable policy of appeasement. His methods inspired fear, but also respect. Niccolò Machiavelli, observing Cesare's campaigns, later used him as the prototype of the ideal ruler in his treatise The Military Successes of Alexander VI's Sons directly threatened Medici interests. Control over central Italy gave the Borgias leverage over Florence, which traditionally depended on trade routes through papal territories. The Borgias' financial policy caused particular concern. To pay for military campaigns, Alexander VI not only depleted the church treasury, but also introduced new taxes, sold church offices, and even confiscated the property of wealthy cardinals under fabricated pretexts. These measures undermined the traditional system of financing the Holy See, in which the Medici Bank played a key role. In the year 1491, a man walked the streets of Florence whose sermons would soon shake the foundations of power of Italy's mighty families. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican monk with burning eyes and the emaciated face of an ascetic, seemed an insignificant figure compared to banking empires and armies. But his words possessed a power that neither the golden florins of the Medici nor the mercenaries of the Borgias could match. Quote zero thundered his voice in the piazza before Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral. Quote 1. Crowds of Florentines hung on his every word, struck by the prophetic gift of the monk who had predicted the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent and the French invasion of Italy. Savonarola made no distinction between his targets. For him, the debauchery of Pope Alexander Borgia was as loathsome as the luxury of the Medici banking house. He proclaimed. His sermons found fertile ground in the hearts of ordinary citizens, weary of the corruption and moral decay of the elites. When the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy in 1494, Savonarola declared him, quote, sent to punish sinners. Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, lacking his father's political wisdom, fled the city without resisting the French. Power in Florence passed to a republican government, where Savonarola, holding no official posts, became the spiritual leader. The monk proclaimed Florence the city of God and began radical reforms. Under his influence, laws against usury and luxury were passed, and bonfires of the vanities were organized, on which luxury items, gambling, and indecent works of art were burned. The Medici banking empire came under attack. Many of their practices were declared sinful, and their palaces were plundered. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI watched the events unfold with growing concern. Savonarola openly called him the Antichrist and called for a church council to depose the pontiff. Such a challenge could not go unanswered. Borgia tried to neutralize the monk by offering him a cardinal's hat, but received a proud refusal. Quote 9. The situation created a paradoxical alliance between sworn enemies. The Medici, exiled from Florence, and the Borgias, hated by Savonarola, suddenly found themselves with a common enemy. Both families began secretly funding opposition to the monk within the city. Alexander VI used church mechanisms, excommunicating Savonarola and forbidding him to preach. But the monk ignored the papal decree, stating that, quote, 10. In the spring of 1498, the Pope's patience ran out. He threatened to place Florence under interdict if the rebellious monk was not apprehended. The threat worked. Many Florentines feared church sanctions. When one of Savonarola's followers volunteered to walk through fire to prove the divine nature of his teacher's prophecies, but refused at the last moment, the monk's popularity plummeted. On April 8, 1498, a mob stormed the San Marco monastery, where Savonarola was hiding. After torture, he confessed to heresy and was executed on May 23 in the very square where he had once delivered his fiery sermons. Thus ended a brief but vivid era when both powerful clans, the Medici bankers and the Borgia church magnates, found themselves under attack from a man armed only with the power of words and faith. Savonarola was defeated, but his influence on Italian history proved significant. He revealed the vulnerability of power systems based on corruption and moral decay. After his death, both the Medici and the Borgias learned lessons from what had happened. The former began to pay more attention to social justice and charity, the latter to be more discreet in demonstrating their licentiousness. But most importantly, both clans understood that popular discontent could become a force capable of crushing even the most powerful dynasties. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, had always been a special target for ambitious Renaissance politicians. For the Medici family, this city was home, the heart of their banking empire, and a symbol of cultural grandeur. For the Borgias, Florence represented a strategic prize, whose capture could forever alter the balance of power in Italy. Alexander VI and his son Cesare understood perfectly. Whoever controlled Florence held the key to northern Italy. But conquering this proud city proved to be a far more complex task than subjugating the small principalities of Romagna. The Florentines, despite internal disagreements, united in the face of external threat. Their devotion to republican traditions, and even more importantly, to economic interests tied to the Medici Bank, created a powerful barrier to the Borgias' ambitions. After the fall of Savonarola in 1498, a fragile equilibrium was established in Florence. Formally, the city remained a republic, but the influence of Medici supporters gradually grew. Alexander VI saw this as a direct threat to his plans. He told Cesare, "The Borgias' strategy to destabilize Florence was multifaceted. Firstly, they attempted to undermine the city's financial standing by diverting trade routes to bypass Florentine territories. Papal legates were instructed to conclude trade agreements with Venice and Genoa, Florence's traditional rivals. Secondly, the Borgias actively supported internal opposition in Florence. Gold flowed from Rome in a torrent to those Florentine families who opposed the return of the Medici. Cesare's agents were particularly assiduous among the common people, spreading rumors that the Medici Bank was robbing ordinary citizens. The third line of attack was diplomatic isolation. Alexander VI used all his authority to persuade the French king and the Spanish monarchs to withdraw their support for Florence. He wrote in his dispatches to European courts. However, the Florentines proved surprisingly resilient in the face of these threats. The Medici Bank, though experiencing difficult times, still remained a powerful financial structure with branches throughout Europe. Its representatives at foreign courts skillfully counteracted papal propaganda, reminding monarchs of the generous loans provided in troubled times. The very structure of Florentine society, with its strong guilds and traditions of civic participation, hindered the subversive activities of Borgia agents. Unlike the feudal domains of Romagna, where Cesare could exploit contradictions between ruler and subjects, Florence was a cohesive community, united by common economic interests. Many Florentines, even those not supporters of the Medici, understood that their prosperity was directly linked to the flourishing of the city's banks and manufactories. Realizing the difficulty of a direct capture of Florence, Cesare Borgia changed tactics. In 1500, he formed a temporary alliance with France, gaining the title of Duke of Valentinois and French military support. Now, with a powerful army behind him, he could exert more direct pressure on Florence. His troops occupied strategic positions around Florentine territories, effectively establishing a semi-blockade of the city. This was a classic strategy of strangulation, not to storm impregnable walls, but to slowly deprive the city of resources and trade links. Behind the scenes of the grand struggle between the Borgias and the Medicis, an invisible war unfolded, a war of information and covert operations. Both families established intricate intelligence networks spanning across Europe. The Medicis transformed their banking branches into true centers for information gathering. Each bank manager in Lyon, Bruges, London, or Barcelona served a dual function, not only overseeing financial flows, but also collecting intelligence on the political intentions of local rulers. Bank employees had access to the commercial secrets of the nobility, aware of loans, debts, and financial difficulties of influential individuals. This information was regularly sent to Florence, where Medici family analysts compiled detailed reports on the state of affairs at European courts. Information regarding the plans of the French king and the Spanish monarchs, the main patrons of the Borgias, was especially valued. The Borgias, lacking such a widespread commercial structure, created their own system of informants, based on the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Every bishop, every abbot, every papal legate became a potential agent of influence. Confessionals turned into sources of invaluable information. The sins of the nobility and politicians became known to Rodrigo Borgia before their own confidants learned of them. Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, expanded his father's spy network to unprecedented scales. He personally recruited agents among the servants of foreign embassies, courtesans who attended noble gentlemen, and even among the personal physicians of cardinals and princes. The practice of intercepting diplomatic correspondence was particularly sophisticated. The Borgias maintained special posts on the main roads leading to Rome, where couriers were subjected to thorough searches under the pretext of quarantine measures or customs control. Letters were opened, copied, and resealed with such skill that recipients rarely noticed the interference. The Medicis countered this with their own courier service, swift messengers who traveled along secret routes and used a complex system of ciphers. The bankers spared no expense on communication security, understanding that information leaks could cost them millions of florins. The palaces of the Roman nobility became a true battlefield. Both the Borgias and the Medicis sought to infiltrate their people into the inner circles of influential cardinals and aristocrats. Bribing servants, seducing secretaries, blackmailing trusted individuals, all means were considered acceptable in this secret war. It reached a point where, in some palaces, half of the servants spied for the Borgias, and the other half for the Medicis. Women played a special role in this confrontation. The famous courtesan Imperia, whose salon was frequented by the most influential people in Rome, was an important source of information for the Borgias. At the same time, the Medicis maintained close ties with several noble Roman matrons, whose husbands held high positions in the papal administration. This invisible war sometimes took a sinister turn. The Borgias gained notoriety as masters of the subtle art of poisoning. The sudden death of undesirable cardinals or diplomats was often attributed to the famous Borgia powder, a deadly poison without taste or smell. The Medicis, on the other hand, preferred more subtle methods of eliminating opponents: compromisation, financial ruin, ecclesiastical sanctions. This shadowy side of the conflict made it truly unpredictable. Neither side could feel safe. No one knew whom to trust. In an atmosphere of general suspicion, even the closest allies could turn out to be secret agents of the enemy. The beginning of the 16th century was marked not only by political upheavals, but also by a severe economic crisis that dealt a devastating blow to the once unshakable banking empire of the Medici. The financial system, built over decades and relying on close ties with the Papal See, began to crack under the pressure of the Borgias' targeted policies. The Medici Bank made a fatal mistake by concentrating too large a share of its assets in papal loans. When Alexander VI ascended to the throne, over a third of all the Florentine bank's funds were invested in financing the Vatican and personal loans to cardinals. A strategy that had brought stable income and political influence for decades suddenly turned into a trap. The new pontiff immediately set about systematically destroying the financial power of his opponents. The first step was the creation of a special commission to audit church debts. Under the pretext of combating usury and simony, Alexander declared many loan agreements with the Medici Bank contrary to canon law and subject to revision. The Church cannot be indebted to those who profit from the sin of usury, proclaimed the Pope, while simultaneously taking loans from Spanish and Genoese bankers on much less favorable terms. This was a masterful move. The Borgias struck at the Medici using the very weapon that had protected the Florentine bankers for centuries: religious rhetoric. Cesare Borgia, appointed by his father as papal treasurer, went even further. He began systematically redirecting church financial flows to bankers associated with the Borgia family. Income from the sale of indulgences, tithe collection, donations from the faithful. All these funds now passed through the hands of Spanish financiers loyal to the Pope. Particularly painful for the Medici Bank was the Vatican's refusal to pay interest on existing loans. Quote 2, declared the papal treasurer. Quote 3, in fact, this meant freezing a significant portion of the Florentine bank's assets indefinitely. The situation was exacerbated by foreign policy factors. The French invasion of Italy disrupted traditional trade routes. Many European monarchs, seeing the weakening position of the Medici, refused to repay old debts or demanded their restructuring on terms unfavorable to the bank. By 1502, the Medici Bank's branches in Bruges, London, and Lyon reported serious difficulties. Trust in the once unshakable financial house was undermined. Depositors, fearing bankruptcy, massively withdrew deposits. The bank's liquidity rapidly declined. To top it all off, the Borgias dealt a blow to the Medici's reputation. Through a network of informers and bribed priests, rumors spread about the unholy practices of the Florentine bankers, their alleged ties to heretics, and even secret dealings with the Ottoman Turks. In the atmosphere of religious tension at the beginning of the 16th century, such accusations were particularly dangerous. Forced to defend themselves on all fronts, the Medici began to make fatal mistakes. In an effort to maintain liquidity, they sold valuable assets at undervalued prices. Trying to retain customers, they offered inflated interest rates on deposits, which only exacerbated their financial problems. By 1503, the once mighty Medici Bank was on the verge of collapse. Its capitalization had shrunk by more than two-thirds. Many branches had to be closed, and its influence on European finance had virtually vanished. This financial collapse clearly demonstrated the effectiveness of the Borgia strategy. Instead of direct military confrontation, which could have led to a unification of Italian states against papal aggression, Alexander and Cesare chose the path of economic strangulation. They struck the Medici at their most vulnerable point, their reputation as a reliable financial institution. August 18, 1503, became the day that forever changed the political map of Italy. Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare dined in Cardinal Adriano Castelli's vineyard when they were suddenly struck by a cruel malady. Both were taken to the Vatican with high fever and agonizing pain. Cesare, possessing a robust constitution, survived, though the illness confined him to his bed for a long time. The 72-year-old pontiff was less fortunate. After a week of torment, on August 25th, Alexander VI breathed his last. Rome plunged into chaos. The Pope's body, quickly blackened and swollen beyond recognition in the summer heat, sparked a wave of rumors about poisoning. Whispers suggested the poison was intended for Cardinal Castelli, with whom the Borgias had a score to settle. But by a fatal coincidence, the goblets were swapped. Others claimed it was revenge from one of the numerous victims of papal intrigues. Still others saw in it the hand of the Medicis, striving to regain lost influence. The truth remained buried with the pontiff in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica. Alexander's death was a blow to the Borgia Empire from which it could not recover. Cesare, weakened by illness, found himself in the most vulnerable position precisely when he needed all his strength and cunning. His enemies, who had waited for years for a moment of revenge, now gathered from all sides, sensing the weakness of the once invincible duke. The new conclave, convened to elect Alexander's successor, became an arena of fierce struggle. Cesare tried to influence the election, using the votes of Spanish cardinals who owed their positions to his father. But his positions were too weak. The elected Pope Pius III, who seemed a compromise figure, died just 26 days after his enthronement. The next conclave brought the final defeat of the Borgia clan. Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, Alexander VI's sworn enemy, became pope, taking the name Julius II. His first decision was to strip Cesare of all ecclesiastical offices and demand the return of the seized territories of Romagna. While the Borgia Empire crumbled like a house of cards, the Medicis slowly began to regain their positions. Piero de' Medici, the talentless son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, died crossing a river while attempting to flee after a military defeat. But his younger brother, Cardinal Giovanni, proved to be a far more skilled politician. Giovanni de' Medici, who received the cardinal's hat at 13, thanks to his father's influence, now used his position in the College of Cardinals to restore family influence. He established close relations with the new Pope Julius II, supporting him in his struggle against the Borgias and French influence in Italy. The Medici Bank, despite serious upheavals, survived thanks to its diversified structure. Unlike the military empire of the Borgias, which relied solely on the personal charisma of Alexander and Cesare, the Medici's financial network had institutional stability. Even after losing a significant portion of its capital, the bank retained invaluable assets, reputation, and connections. Cesare Borgia, deprived of papal support, quickly lost control over his possessions. The cities of Romagna, which had recently trembled before his name, one by one refused to obey him. Local tyrants, displaced by him, returned with the support of Venice and papal troops. The great state in central Italy, which the Borgias had created with such difficulty, crumbled before their eyes. In December 1503, Cesare was arrested by order of Pope Julius and imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo. A year later, he was transferred to Spain, where he spent 2 years in captivity before escaping to his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre. There, in 1507, he died in an insignificant skirmish, an inglorious end for a man who once held all of Italy in fear. The confrontation between two great Renaissance dynasties left an indelible mark on history, extending far beyond their era. Today, 5 centuries later, we continue to feel the echoes of this struggle in various aspects of modern life. The banking practices introduced by the Medici laid the foundation for the financial system we use to this day. The credit system, international transfers, and principles of banking accounting. All these innovations, born from within the Florentine bank, transformed into modern financial instruments. When we use a credit card or send money to another country, we unwittingly pay homage to the genius of Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici. No less significant was the legacy of the Borgias. The political methods of Rodrigo and Cesare, their unscrupulousness in achieving goals, and their mastery of manipulation became synonymous with Machiavellianism. It is no coincidence that Niccolò Machiavelli, observing Cesare Borgia's actions, based his famous treatise The Prince on them, a book that remains a desktop guide for politicians and businessmen to this day. The phrase, "the end justifies the means," though not directly attributed to Machiavelli, accurately reflects the philosophy embodied by the Borgias. The cultural patronage of the Medici changed the face of European art. Michelangelo and Botticelli, Donatello and Lippi, all created under the patronage of the Florentine bankers. The Medici understood that true immortality is given not by money and power, but by beauty and knowledge. Lorenzo the Magnificent collected ancient manuscripts and founded the first public library in Europe, preserving invaluable works of ancient authors for us. Today, museums around the world are full of masterpieces commissioned by this outstanding dynasty. The Borgias, in turn, left an indelible mark on popular culture. Their name became a byword for political unscrupulousness and cruelty. Countless novels, films, TV series, and games depict members of this family as masters of intrigue and poisoning. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, and his son Cesare transformed into archetypal villains whose images continue to excite the imagination of people worldwide. The confrontation between these families also changed the Catholic Church itself. The scandals associated with the Borgia rule and the financial machinations involving the Medici Bank undermined the moral authority of the Vatican and became one of the prerequisites for the Reformation. Martin Luther, who nailed his famous theses to the doors of the Wittenberg Church in 1517, criticized precisely those vices of the Church that the Borgias embodied: simony, nepotism, moral decay. The history of the rivalry between the Borgias and the Medici teaches us that personal ambitions and family interests can become the driving force of historical processes. Behind the great events that change the face of the world, there are often not abstract ideas or economic patterns, but specific people with their passions, vices, and talents. Both families sought power and wealth, but chose different paths to these goals. The Medici created a stable system of influence based on financial power and cultural patronage. Their power was informal, but no less real. They ruled from the shadows, avoiding official titles, but holding in their hands the threads that controlled politics and economics. The Borgias, on the contrary, sought direct control and formal power. Their strategy was more straightforward and aggressive, but ultimately less sustainable. The empire created by Alexander and Cesare collapsed almost instantly after the Pope's death, while the influence of the Medici lasted for centuries.